Hi, and welcome to the Journalist Resource webinar, The Future of Federal Funding for Hispanic-Serving Institutions. I'm Denise Ordway, and I'm the managing editor of the Journalist Resource. And today we're going to be discussing a group of colleges and universities that participate in a federal program that's designed to expand opportunities for and improve the graduation rates of Hispanic students. So that we are all on the same page when we're talking about Hispanic serving institutions, we're talking about public colleges and universities and private nonprofit colleges and universities where at least 25% of the undergraduate students identify as Hispanic. You'll hear me and the other speakers sometimes refer to Hispanic serving institutions as HSIs, which is a common term used to refer to these institutions. Schools that are formally designated as HSIs by the U.S. Department of Education qualify to compete for funding from multiple federal agencies, but primarily the U.S. Department of Education is the organization that provides the bulk of the funding. As some of you know, the state of Tennessee and the nonprofit organization Students for Fair Admissions filed a federal lawsuit last summer arguing that providing federal funding to colleges and universities based on their percentage of Hispanic students is discriminatory and unconstitutional. In September, the U.S. Department of Education announced that it was cutting a huge chunk of HSI funding. And in December, the U.S. Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel issued an opinion on the issue that essentially agreed that HSI programs are unconstitutional. Also last month, another new thing to be aware of, a bill was introduced in Congress that would eliminate federal funding for all higher education institutions that receive federal money based on their percentage of students who are of a certain race or ethnicity. Our three guest speakers are going to share a lot of really important information that I hope will help you better understand and cover HSIs. But before I introduce them, I'm going to, a couple quick housekeeping things. One is, if you have questions, and I hope lots of you do, please put those questions in the question box and not the chat box. And when you leave a question, please include your name and your news outlet or the organization you're with. I also want to note that everything we talk about here is on the record, so you should feel free to report from this event if you would like. I'm going to quickly introduce our speakers. We have Daryl Burnett, who is a senior editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education. He oversees news coverage of HSIs and other minority-serving institutions. He's also a member of the National Education Writers Association's Board of Directors. Dan Mornoff is executive director of the American Civil Rights Project. It's a nonprofit law firm representing parties to the federal lawsuit that is challenging HSI funding. He's also an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And we're also going to hear from Anne Marie Nunez, a professor at the University of Texas at El Paso, who studies HSIs and Hispanics in higher education more broadly. She's also executive director of the Diana Natalicio Institute for Hispanic Student Success. I'm going to start this conversation off by asking Anne Marie, please, to give us a broad overview of HSIs, primarily the research on these institutions.
Thank you, Denise, for that introduction. Can you all see my slides?
Yes.
Awesome, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to share comprehensive data and provide an overview of HSIs from a wide range of sources. These are sources from scholars who study HSIs, but also broader think tanks that are studying economic mobility. And so it's really important to know the data when we are talking about HSIs and to have tools and resources for reporters to understand HSIs when they're talking about them. Let me see if I can, is it, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So these data come from a range of sources. And again, the data together illustrate that HSIs are a linchpin of the US workforce. Currently, HSIs comprise 20% of post-secondary institutions. They enroll 1/3 of all college students in the United States. So they have a broad reach. 35% of students in HSIs are first-generation college-going students. And HSIs serve a really high share of low-income students. 37% of all Pell Grant students in the United States are enrolled in HSIs. In addition, HSIs enroll more Black students and more Native American students than are enrolled at historically Black colleges and universities. So more Black students are enrolled at HSIs than HBCUs, and more Native American students are enrolled at HSIs than TCUs.
Mm-hmm.
There are some common misconceptions about HSIs when we look at the data. The first of all is that HSI federal grants are race exclusive. HSI federal grants are designed to use institutional criteria, are based on institutional criteria and not individual admissions, racial admissions quotas, designed to strengthen capacity for all students. So if we're thinking about admissions, for example, I work at a large 4-year HSI, and my institution is open access. So students who meet college eligibility requirements can attend my institution. There are not admissions quotas, there's no exclusion. The majority of HSIs are broad access institutions, and about half of them are community colleges. The second myth is that each HSI automatically receives federal money. Not all HSIs receive federal grants. They undergo a competitive application process based on merit. HSI grants only serve certain groups of students. That's a third myth about HSIs. In fact, HSI grants often serve as modest, targeted investments that are used for campus-wide improvements that benefit all students. And so this brings us to what the research says are 3 truths about HSIs. The first is that they're effective. They've made disproportionately high contributions to the workforce. And so when we look at last year's Carnegie and Access earnings classification system, which is for all post-secondary institutions, 4-year HSIs are 3 times as likely as non-HSIs to provide the highest economic mobility for all of their graduates, not graduates from certain groups, for all of their graduates. 77% of graduates from HSIs, again, all graduates, not graduates from certain groups, recoup their tuition costs within 5 years, and HSIs offer lower tuition, which makes that figure easier to attain. On that point, there are 3, this second point is that HSIs are efficient. So they produce these outcomes with fewer resources. They serve greater shares of low-income students, but they're also fostering strong economic mobility. They operate with 68 cents to the dollar in federal funding compared to non-HSIs. And also 1/3 per student endowments of, when we compare them with non-HSIs, they're working with 1/3 the endowment per student in terms of their operations. The third is that HSIs are enterprising. This is the third truth, that they have led innovations in strategies for student success of these historically under-resourced populations that often haven't had access to post-secondary opportunities. So HSIs incur higher costs because they're often serving students who are the first in their families to go to college, or low-income students who may come in with less academic preparation, who may need more tutoring, need more developmental education in math or reading. They need higher wraparound services, more support services. And so they've been innovators in developing new strategies and supports, including with federal investment and that has helped them. And economists have found that funding from the Department of Education investments in Title V funding for Hispanic serving institutions are associated with increased completion rates at HSIs and also decreased debt, again, for all students who attend HSIs. And so these are really important things to keep in mind when we think about investing in HSIs, their broad reach and the mobility that they offer. So just to conclude with some key takeaways, if we look at all this research collectively, HSIs deliver a strong return on investment. They strengthen the US workforce through educational innovation. They are advancing economic mobility, and they're fortifying US global and economic leadership. And if we think about current federal concerns about accountability of institutions to produce good earnings for their students post-graduation, HSIs are meeting those criteria. HSIs are more likely to be institutions where you can find those good results happening. And I think we can all agree that HSIs are meeting some of those accountability concerns and that they are contributing strongly to the US economy when we think about the research. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share this research. I have several references for all of these data points for those who are interested. Thank you.
Denise, you're muted.
Oh, we can't hear you, Denise.
You're still muted.
I am so sorry. I was thanking Anne Marie quickly and letting people know that she has shared a handout with me that I will share at some point. Dan, if we could please hear from you next.
Sure, my pleasure. Denise, you had mentioned at the beginning a little bit about the structure of the HSI programs, and I'm going to be honing in on one particular detail that you mentioned, which is that they condition eligibility of particular institutions on the current enrolled racial balances of their students. Now, I want to be clear that there are three Hispanic serving institutions programs, and that structure isn't unique to them. There are actually 10 programs run just out of the Department of Education that have a similar structure where the racial demographics of current enrolled students make a school eligible or not to compete for federal funding. That larger set I'm going to refer to as the minority serving institutions programs. And I also want to be clear about what I'm not talking about, because there are other federal programs that you might have in mind and that it's important to bear in mind are different. Federal support for HBCUs, for tribal colleges and universities, they don't have that kind of criteria. They function through different eligibility standards, and nothing that I'm going to say, therefore, seems to have any bearing on their constitutionality. With that said, the first thing I should really get to is, so what's wrong with that? Biggest picture, there are going to be two things that I want to flag for you. One is going to sound a lot like equal protection, and one of them has to do with the spending clause. On the equal protection side, we have known since the 1950s that there is a constitutional constraint on federal power that runs exactly parallel to the constraint that the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause imposes on states and their subdivisions and entities. In both cases, the equal protection component tells us that governments can only use race to the extent that that usage satisfies what the courts call strict scrutiny. And that has two components. It asks first whether there is a compelling interest in play, and secondly, whether the usage of race is narrowly tailored to serve that compelling purpose. I should unpack both of those. Under modern case law, there are two, and only two, compelling purposes sufficient to satisfy strict scrutiny. One of them is remedial. The remedial idea is this, is if a government has in the recent past discriminated against people based on race, to fix the harm that it did to those specific individuals, it can use race uh, in fixing it. Uh, the second, the second is based on the fact that governments run prisons, and because there are prisoners in prisons, those governments have custodial obligations to the people they imprison, specifically to preserve their their lives and safety. So when there is a race riot in a prison, the courts recognize as compelling the governmental interest in keeping those people alive and say that it's compelling. That is sufficiently compelling to justify separating the warring parties for the duration of the race riot. That's it. That's the whole list. There's no third entry on that list. So that's what's compelling. And then our question as to what does narrow tailoring mean? Narrow tailoring means that the usage of race, uh, there is no other way to achieve the compelling end. There, they can't just assume that there's no other way. They have to actually search. They have to rely on data. They have to conclude that there is no less discriminatory way to serve the valid, compelling interest. And by the way, when they run that analysis, that's not a one-time thing. Like it isn't good forever. In order to continue to make use of race in government, a government has to occasionally refresh its analysis and make sure that, yes, this is still compelling. And yes, there is still no way to do it. The rule of thumb is that has to happen about every 5 years. On the spending clause side, we all know Congress's spending power is extraordinarily broad. On the other hand, it's not limitless. And since the 1980s, we've known that one of the main limitations on Congress's spending power is what gets called the independent constitutional bar doctrine. That's not actually a complicated idea. It just asks you, recipient, does something in the Constitution make it unconstitutional for you to do a thing? If the answer to that is yes, the doctrine says federal money can't induce that violation. So the Supreme Court gave us two examples in the 80s and in all the opinions since, wind up quoting it. The two examples are federal money cannot induce a denial of due process, and federal money cannot induce invidious discrimination. Okay, so how does all that apply to the structure of the MSI programs? Well, the first question would be, is the federal government using race? Well, yes. Is there a compelling purpose to that usage of race? It's something akin to separating warring parties in a race riot or fixing the harm the government has done through its own recent past discrimination to particular individuals. If you answered yes to either of those, well, then you talk about whether the MSI programs are narrowly tailored. Has the government in the recent past, probably within 5 years, reanalyzed and determined this interest is compelling and there is no other way to serve it? On the spending side, you would ask the question questions, are the minority serving institutions programs inducing race conscious decisions? And on that side, I'd encourage you to read an article written by Alex Heidemann. It ran in the Federalist Society Review, which, among other things, pulls together quotes from a number of colleges and universities' strategic plans explaining what they're doing to pursue changes to their enrolled racial balances in order to obtain MSI status, in order to obtain access to MSI program funding. It certainly looks like the answer is yes. Denise also mentioned there have been some announcements coming out of the executive branch. I'm happy to shed more light on those to the extent that's helpful in questions. And that there is this litigation. As she said, I'm involved in that litigation. I am not going to get involved in any of the details of it. I don't think we need that, and I don't think we have time. I will just flag for you, it exists. It's in the Eastern District of Tennessee. It's called Tennessee versus Department of Education, and that's where legal arguments about all these issues are going to be made to a federal judge, and where you're going to want to watch what happens for a ruling in the first instance. I want to throw just one more level of detail about those developments in Congress. Senator Banks from Indiana is the one who filed the bill we're talking about. He calls it his Pell Act. Um, the way it functions is, yes, it repeals the minority serving institutions programs, and it rechannels funds into an expanded and enhanced Pell Grant program in order to better assure that America's neediest students can afford college wherever they want to go and whatever their race might be or those of their classmates. I think it's worth mentioning that to whatever extent any group remains underprivileged, this approach would help them most. And that it at least appears that it would do so in a way that's fair, at least race neutral, doesn't appear to have any constitutional difficulties, and would maximize those students' control over their own education. There's obviously a lot more that we could say. I hope that we'll have the chance to in questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. And Daryl, would really like to hear from you on this topic as an education journalist and someone who's guiding coverage of HSIs and minority serving institutions.
Sure. So I've overseen some of the Chronicle's coverage of HSIs, MSIs, and I find this panel to be very compelling. I'm glad you kind of brought us together, Denise. The first thing I want to talk about is, I mean, we're journalists consider ourselves a family, so I'm going to be frank with us, and we're going to talk about. I would like to talk about how we miss this story. So I think that journalists are very culpable in the misperception of HSIs, of MSIs, of HBCUs, of this debate at large. And I think that we're, as I'll get to later on in my presentation, I think that we continue to make errors in our coverage of this issue. So I'm just going to talk about some of the internal problems we have within our newsroom. So one is just flawed MSI, HBCU and MSI coverage. Typically, we cover HBCUs and MSIs as either they're all good or all bad. They're either fantastic or they're the worst thing ever. And as a fourth generation Black college graduate, I will say up until George Floyd, HBCUs were the basket case of higher ed. And then after George Floyd, they were the savior of Black America. So there's a variety of reasons as to why that was, but I do think sometimes we placate coverage of minority serving institutions. We cover them in a very flawed way. We try to make sweeping conclusions about their culture, their outcomes, and oftentimes it's based on flawed data. And sometimes this data comes from advocates. Sometimes it comes from the institutions themselves. Sometimes they come from our own newsrooms. And we oftentimes are trying to perpetuate ideas about these schools that are based off of either stereotypes, et cetera. Um, we only write about them when scandal breaks out. We're kind of seeing this right now with Morris Brown in Atlanta. You know, a president resigns, and all of a sudden, even though the school only serves 500 students, there's like TikTok coverage sort of deal, which adds to the perception that these schools are either all bad or all good, or we don't write about them at all. And I think HSIs in particular suffer from this because they are in rural areas and they're regional colleges. A lot of them are regional colleges or they're small private colleges. So this kind of adds to the misperception that we ourselves as journalists push out. And this kind of goes to my larger point about skewed coverage of the higher ed landscape. We are biased toward the schools that we went to. We're biased toward the schools that are in our backyards that are oftentimes urban or selective colleges versus where the vast majority of students actually do attend colleges, which is regional colleges, which we call like the workhorse of higher ed, and community colleges, which are typically where a lot of HSIs are. And then to a larger point, just our own coverage of race. It still is not the best. We still have a lot of work to do for a whole variety of reasons, but this is very acute with HSI stories. So we lower our journalism standards. We misquote people. We put out bad, we don't, our sourcing is bad. We have one spokesperson talking for an entire community. We task reporters to write about minorities, even though sometimes they are not the best people to write about minority serving institutions. For example, I went to Hampton University in Virginia, and instead of the Daily Press having their higher ed reporter cover Hampton University, the minority community reporter covered Hampton University. We're quick to draw conclusions. racism is full of a lot of tropes, stereotypes, etc. And oftentimes journalists are looking for answers rather than trying to dig into problems. And then we struggle writing about internal conflict. So this is very, very, um, I think the best way to describe this is within minority communities, whether or not integration or segregation is the answer to our problems is a very hot topic. It's something that we debate all the time. There's a reason why only 10% of Black students attend HBCUs. And then we ignore conservatives. So I'm kind of glad that Dan is actually here because uh, so we started covering this debate because we ran into a blog that has cited Dan's work. And one of the things that I was so fascinated by was how many policy papers and research papers were out there about the about racialized policy within higher ed and how little we had written about this. And this is a chronicle of higher education, but just mainstream media covering this debate within minority serving institutions as to how those schools should be funded. It is a rife debate that goes back 50, 60, 70 years. This is not something new. So
Mhm.
I understand that the Trump administration's actions have been sudden and intense, but this is a long work up to where we are now. Okay, so now I'll talk about some of the stories that are on the horizon for us as a Chronicle, but I think that all journalists should be cognizant of. One is college finances. So, one of the biggest differences between HSIs and HBCUs is that HSIs are hundreds and hundreds of schools, and they are, the size of the University of Florida to the size of Houston-Tillotson in Texas, right? So they look very, very different. For small HSIs, I am very interested in the fact that when the federal government decides to pull multi-million-dollar grants, suddenly that has a huge impact on their budget and how they go about um, paying their employees, basically. So we've already seen a PBI shutdown, which is Martin University in Indiana. And one of the things that they cited was they lost a state grant and a federal grant that was targeted toward their school because they serve a disproportionate number of Black students. Um, Implications of colorblind initiative. So America has made a choice. It's a very sudden choice, but we have made a choice to move away from race conscious initiatives to colorblind initiatives. Now, again, hot debate within minority communities, but whether or not things like student centers for students of color, student centers for Black students, student centers for Latino students, or training for professors on culturally sensitive material or trying to hire more minorities to teach minority students, whether or not that is the answer to fixing the high dropout rate amongst Latino and Black students. That question is now on the hot burner because we are now trying a new initiative, which is colorblind. And whether or not that's going to work, I think the research is going to be interesting, and I think it's going to be interesting to hear from both the students and administrators over how they go about doing this. And this is especially true for emerging HSIs. So we have a tracker at the Chronicle of Higher Education, which we're tracking DEI changes. And the most intense DEI initiatives were at emerging institutions, emerging HSIs, because they were looking to get federal money. And so there were lots of people who were laid off. There were lots of initiatives that were ended. There's a lot of contention between students and administrators right now um, over student support initiatives that are now gone, et cetera. So that's an ongoing story for us. Changes to how campuses define and address discrimination on campus. So again, one of the big problems that a lot of emerging HSIs were having was these were universities that are sitting in communities in which there are large Latino populations that were not enrolling at their university. Why that is for a vast number of reasons. One of which is some of these universities used to not allow for Latinos to attend their universities. So these are some of the schools that had Jim Crow policies back in the day, and that legacy still sits with that campus. And so the universities were trying to change that attitude, that perception, et cetera, and trying to weed racist professors out of their classroom. So now that they cannot be race conscious in trying to fix these problems, what does a colorblind what is the colorblind initiatives to address racism in the classroom? That is just a ongoing story that I think we should be covering. Student success. Latino students still attend college at a lower rate than white students. So dropout rate has all kinds of implications for local economy, has implications for students, it has implications for families, et cetera. So what will it take to get students from, freshman year to the graduation stage? And then obviously the economy. So the reason why politicians created the HSI grant was because there was a lower Latino college going rate amongst Latino community, and that was having it was devastating local economies. It was making it difficult to build leaders, to bring in industries, et cetera. So now that this grant money is going away, now that colleges have literally said out loud, we no longer care about diversity. Okay, well, what does that mean for the local economy? Okay, now I'm going to talk about a bigger story that I think that we are really missing right now. So I think that the coverage of DEI is downstream coverage. We are actually writing about the effects of something else, which I think is occurring, and that is white enrollment. White enrollment is dropping at a rate that is much more dramatic than the demographic changes. So oftentimes we describe this as, oh, there are demographic changes that are happening. Well, what we have discovered at the Chronicle is this: a lot of white students are deciding not to go to college for a whole variety of reasons. And there's little research, there's little examination, there's little scrutiny, the same sort of scrutiny that was provided for Black men in the 90s when there were high crime rates in the inner city communities, right? We're not necessarily giving white communities that same sort of scrutiny. So what I see happening as a journalist is just there's a lot of resource hoarding happening right now. And when you talk to a lot of conservatives about why they are upset about DEI initiatives, they will say out loud, it's because a lot of white students aren't going to college anymore. So this is sort of like a little bit, we have to divert our attention. I mean, we can write multiple stories at once, but we have to also cover what's actually happening in the white community right now, which is desperation to get a lot of these kids into college. And this is not happening in rural areas or low income communities. What we're discovering is that this is happening in suburban communities, suburban America. Okay, so lastly, I'll just talk about places to find story ideas. One, paint the landscape, understand where HSIs are, understand where emerging institutions are, who are the leaders, who are the board members, who are the faculty members, etc. Read the research papers. Research is now going to start anew because now all of a sudden everybody's going to colorblind initiatives. Read policy papers. They are interesting. There's obviously whether or not policy should be racially codified is a hot debate, especially crime, housing, et cetera, but also in education. I can't emphasize enough. In K-12, we say segregation is bad. In higher ed, we say segregation is good. Why have education reporters made that conclusion, such a dramatically different conclusion for higher ed than they did for K-12? Read policies. The DEI policies are very explicit as to what, sometimes explicit, sometimes not explicit, about what can and cannot occur on college campuses. Talk to college leaders, but also talk to students and talk to faculty. And then some hazards to watch out for. One, the language that we use when writing about race is it's broad, it is not specific, it's meaningless. DEI is three different initiatives, some of which conflict with each other. And so these are words that politicians use to brush over internal conflict within communities. Focusing on institutions rather than people. Again, at the end of the day, this is about whether or not Latino students are going to college and if they are having a good experience, right? And then the relevance of MSI status. So most institutions, most journalism institutions have style guides in which they are saying only mention the status of the institution if it's relevant. So why are we saying Morris Brown, an HBCU, their president resigned? Why not Morris Brown's president resign? Why is the HBCU status relevant? Are we trying to say something larger about minority communities? And then avoid tropes. So the trope of minorities can't teach, nor can they manage money. They should not be running institutions. There's very historically loaded trope that, there have been studies as to how the media both perpetuates that trope. So understand when you are actually participating in the stereotype making. Okay, I think that's the end of my presentation.
Excellent, Daryl. Thank you so much. I can see you put a lot of thought and time into that. So thank you very much to help the journalists who are watching and listening. I'm going to just ask one question and go right to audience questions. A question that I think I'm going to ask just in case it doesn't get asked. And I'm really curious to hear from all of you, if you wouldn't mind. You know, let's say the federal lawsuit challenging HSI funding and challenging funding for most minority serving institutions, let's say it's successful. Help us think about the consequences, short term, long term, not just for HSIs and MSIs, but what about higher ed broadly? Like, you know, because we might not be thinking about, flagship state university in Arizona, for example, or that's probably not a good example. I think they are at HSI. I don't know, Kansas or you know what I'm saying, University of Florida. What are the implications for these institutions?
So, I mean, I can jump in on one piece of that, and just to say that you honed in specifically on the litigation. What the relief in the litigation might be, and whether it is what you described, is I think very much in question. Um, the plaintiffs didn't ask to end funding for the HSI programs. The plaintiffs asked to open the door to broader competition to allow all schools to compete for federal money on an even basis. Um, so if that were to happen, you might have a very different projection of a future than in a world where relief looked like ending the programs. Um, this might be a good time to point out that we don't know what the Department of Education is going to do with the ruling from the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice. They've told us that they're looking at that question. Um, the Office of Legal Counsel, though, their opinion was that most, not quite all, of the programs that they analyzed, they don't believe can be bifurcated to take out the discriminatory provisions. So, does that mean that the programs are gone for the interim future? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe that'll change when there's a court ruling, which may or may not agree with OLC and may grant very different relief than what OLC has seemingly suggested. Uh, these are all just things to watch as matters continue to unfold.
I think that if these, legal trends move in that direction that you're talking about, if we look at the data, and Daryl really highlights some important points about centering student success, I think we have to look at the effects on students. And HSI serve 30% of students in the United States, and disproportionately high shares of students who haven't had access to college opportunities. And so I think we can see, given the other positive outcomes of HSIs, that students who have historically not had opportunities to attend college are going to see disproportionately negative impacts on their success. And so I'm very concerned as somebody who conducts research on student success, and also foreclosing possibilities for a lot of students who might have entered the workforce, with higher qualifications, with the kinds of skills that today's economy needs, might not. And the idea of having all institutions being eligible to compete, there are more well-resourced institutions that have more advantages in applying for these funding. They have grant writers. They have, think about Harvard. I mean, they have this historical, they're already ahead of the game in getting access to these resources, and they serve far fewer students. So I think that's a concern. And if people are concerned about student success, the economy, access to the workforce, participation, I think that's something that everybody can agree to be concerned about if these legal trends go in that direction.
Thank you, Anne Marie.
Can I throw in one additional thought there?
Sure, Dan, go ahead.
Um, it's I'm glad that Daryl flagged this. There is a wide variety of schools that are Hispanic serving institutions, and it's true that some of those are small and rural and ill-resourced. Of course, it's also true that the University of Texas is an HSI and has the second largest endowment in the world. So, I mean, we need to, and I mean, like, if you want to talk about advantages in seeking grants, I can't imagine an institution that has greater advantages in seeking grants. So, like, it's important to bear in mind impacts will not be even and may not, and there may be very dramatic differences within this. It's
Right.
worth
I
pulling
do
apart
think
those points.
I do think it's important to situate that comment in the data. The majority of HSI, the University of Texas at Austin is one institution. I work at the University of Texas at El Paso, which is open access. And the majority of HSIs are broad access. About half of them are community colleges. And so they admit everybody. So those are a very, very small, less than 1%, if even 0.5% of HSIs. And I think this goes back to Daryl's point. Sorry, Daryl, we'll turn it back to you. I think Daryl raised the importance of understanding institutional diversity of HSIs. And I actually was the first researcher 10 years ago to write about the institutional diversity of HSIs.
Thank you. Thank you. Daryl would love to hear from you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm hoping that folks can just engage in the issue. It's so interesting. I mean, you're seeing two folks on different side of the aisle. This gets even more interesting once you get to the actual institution and the inner warring within institutions as to how they should reach these students, how they should serve these students, etc., is so animating. It's so fascinating. So I would just encourage us to maybe like I'm as a journalist, we have the benefit of not having to predict the future, but just watch and see and write stories as you see them, but build sources, etc. I mean, engage in the issue because it's just a really fascinating debate.
Thank you. Thank you, Daryl. And I will stress again, I think it was a point that Daryl made about dig into the research. There's a lot of research out there. A lot of it looks at a small group of colleges or a small group of states. So keep that in mind when you're kind of thinking about the results that you're looking at. But there's so much in the research to delve into and understand. I'm going to start with some questions right now. I'm going to take, let's see, the first question I'm going to take is from, oh, here's a good one. Lucinda Breeding at the Denton Record Chronicle. And she asked, the Alliance of Hispanic-Serving Research Universities formed in part to recruit more Hispanic grad students to STEM. What could their fate be? And I think you've touched on it a little bit, but STEM being a big emphasis and trying to bring a wider group of students and professionals into the field. I think that's a great question.
Right, and I actually just did the calculation. I was right in that 0.5%, about 4 point, yeah, 0.5%, just under 1% of HSIs are in that category of what are considered highly active Research One HSIs, and many of those are members of this Hispanic-Serving Research University Alliance. And even within them, to this point about institutional diversity, they've had, even within that group, there's a wide array of, you have flagships, but then you also have historically very, very under-resourced institutions, even in that group. There's a lot of research showing, even within the same system, even within the same public university system, right? The University of California system and the UT system. Institutions that became HSIs more recently are more likely to be those research institutions, right? And so one of the reasons that the HSRU formed was because they serve a lot of students from again, these first generation college going students who historically have not had high access to post-secondary education and graduate degrees. And so I can't predict exactly what will happen, but it may diminish, it may compromise some of the quality of the funding. At the same time, when we consider the data that I presented earlier, so many of the HSRU institutions have such high return on investment. A lot of them, I believe about half of them, provide the highest economic mobility. So even though they are they're providing high earnings and high access. So let's say that the funding, shifts to current concerns about accountability and earnings, right? Whether or not colleges are producing earnings, whether students can recoup their costs. Even some of these HSRU institutions would fit on those kinds of qualifications in terms of how they fit the economy. So, I think it's hard to predict the future with HSRUs, but it's important that many of them also meet those criteria of providing access to high quality education.
Okay, thank you. Would anybody else want to weigh in?
I just wanted to
Sure.
emphasize one of the flaws in our DEI coverage before DEI was, banned, was that we did not scrutinize DEI initiatives. So there are, and when I say scrutinize, I mean cover them objectively, cover them with integrity. So one of the things that I would encourage this student, for example, this reporter, for example, to do is instead of wondering what could happen to STEM students in this program, go talk to the actual Latino students who are in this program. I mean, one of the things that our reporters continue to discover is there's a wide variety of how students feel about racialized programs. Some students think it's the best thing ever. Some students think it's the worst thing ever. Some students think it's humiliating. Some students think it's affirming. And they react in different ways. And depending on who's actually in charge of the program and the way the program is funded, which a lot of HSIs are saying, no, we don't spend the HSI grant money on these programs. It's for all students, right? Even the way that they're spending it is just highly, highly, highly controversial. So that is one of the things that I would encourage a reporter to lean into is go talk to the Latino students, go talk to the Latino faculty members. How do you receive these programs? How do you experience these programs?
Thank you, Daryl. I'm gonna go to the next question. We have a question from Victor Rodriguez Velasquez. He's an higher education journalist at the Center for Investigative Journalism in Puerto Rico. And his excellent question is, in light of the recent Department of Justice memorandum on the constitutionality of race-based DOE programs, what questions should I be asking federal education authorities about how this interpretation applies to universities in Puerto Rico, where approximately 97% of students are classified as Hispanic?
Oh man, I'm kind of jealous of this reporter because um, I think University of Puerto Rico is one of the biggest beneficiaries of HSI grant money. That university system there has suffered financially for years. So having this much grant money pulled from them all of a sudden is just um, and again, I don't want to be too loaded here, but just my peripheral understanding of how America has treated Puerto Rico's school system at large is a loaded history. It's a very, very loaded racialized history. So I would just encourage you to go to your local officials, basically,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of accountability reporting.
Yeah, and I would say if you were to the data that I just said, I just stated, if you were to look at, the cents to the dollar that Puerto Rican HSIs operate in comparison to non-HSIs, it would be far lower, given what just Daryl said, right? Like there's historically low investments in Puerto Rican infrastructure. And if you were to look at Puerto Rican institutions are probably 4 times as likely to provide the high social mobility. The social mobility and economic mobility that Puerto Rican HSIs provide is even higher than when you look at HSIs as a whole, in part because they have these lower resources that they're working with. So I think that's really important that Puerto Rican HSIs are particularly productive in terms of how we're thinking about economy and accountability in terms of earnings.
I would encourage us to tease out a different element here, folding back on something that Anne Marie said earlier and something I think I may have as well. Um, if you were to retarget funding from the federal government based on non-racial categories, and if you chose efficiency, social mobility, those schools in Puerto Rico are going to do very well, probably better than they do now through the existing HSI programs. If you were to retarget funding away from race-based decision making into uh, to target instead the neediest of students in a vastly enhanced Pell Grant program, the lion's share of that money is going to go places like those schools in Puerto Rico. So, bear in mind, the it, no one is talking about end these programs, full stop, move on with your lives. At least no one I've encountered. There might be such people making those arguments, but um, if there is a replacement, it is worth considering how those are going to play out as well. And the fact that if we take seriously all of the structural concerns that are usually cited to as justifications for these and lots of other race-based programs, the move away from race-based programming would still target almost all of the benefits potentially to the same institutions, but in ways that don't get people's hackles up like I don't know there is a white community, Daryl, I'm sorry, but like to the extent there is, if you are getting money to schools in a non-discriminatory way and it happens to be the same schools, that might be better for all concerned. And I'll throw out one other detail, which isn't really responsive to the questioner. I'm sorry. But it is worth bearing in mind that, it is true that the Trump administration has had a series of announcements over the last few months that are relevant here. I would question whether that means that the commitment to race-blind decision-making is new. Well, it is certainly true that there have been actions that of governments in the past that are not race blind. America largely made that decision in 1964 with the passage of Title VI. Title VI on its face affirmatively says no one will be not denied any benefit on the basis of race. So depending on one's perspective, that could be the last 6 months, but that could be the last 70 years, 60 years.
I just wanted to, the reason why I think this debate is so fascinating is if there are any reporters who cover K-12, you would know that the government is really, really bad when it comes to measuring poverty. It's another crazy debate. I mean, if you think, sending money out based off of race is complicated, imagine sending money based off of poverty. How do you measure poverty? How do you measure transfer rates of colleges? All these things are things that the government has a really bad record of actually identifying.
Excellent point, Daryl. I'm going to jump to the next question from Andre Salkin. I apologize if I mispronounced your last name. Of the Santa Fe, New Mexican. He's asking for tips on measuring impact from funding cuts.
Yeah, the specificity matters. It's kind of why I'm so animated by the false language we use around race. But the more characters you can actually name, the more programs you can name, the more you can actually witness some of these initiatives. Um, the richer the journalism. So I would just encourage you to kind of, again, I can't emphasize enough that oftentimes with race coverage, journalists lower the bar of journalism. They lower the standards. So in this instance, I think you actually need to raise the standards because what success can look like just varies widely.
And Denise referred to a handout that I compiled and, for reporters with the references that I mentioned in this report and that were in the last slide. And those are very, very carefully researched, pieces. And I think a point Daryl alluded to, a lot of times there's a lack of standard and comparable measures, right? And the government hasn't done a great job of standard and comparable measures for each post-secondary institution on these data. And so what we had tried to call was as standard and comparable as we could on measures such as graduation rates, completion rates, student debt load, are students recouping their earnings? And so what we have in that sheet include kind of national, institution by institution comparable, right? Comparable and standard data on measures like completion rates, access, earnings, debt? Are people recouping earnings? Again, so I know I just repeated myself, but those are some of the measures that are available that you can find that are standard and comparable in data. Sometimes programs are going to vary from institution to institution. They're going to vary in terms of how they're implemented. But some of what I shared has some of the standard or comparable metrics.
Okay. This is a really, really good question. We've got 5 minutes left, so if we could try to answer it pretty quickly, if you're able, from Jennifer Berger of Cal Matters. How can we use usaspending.gov data to find HSI grants that have been terminated?
I'm smiling right now because as somebody at an institution that is an HSI, and as Daryl said, a lot of HSIs have had grants terminated. I personally have not used the USA.gov website. I don't know that there are accurate, there are people who are initiating their own efforts to track these, but I don't know how much quality control there is and how up to date the data are on the grants that are terminated. Because sometimes grants are terminated and reinstated. Sometimes data about the terminated grants is not going up on these websites. And I say this with real firsthand experience at an institution that has seen terminated grants. So I would just be careful about the sources that you're using for this, to look into who's compiling the data. There are some groups that are where a lot of people are coming together, and institutions that are trying to do it and bring together other institutions, so that are trying to kind of self-report. But I would be skeptical of the up-to-date accuracy of this. And if you are going to use those sources, I would look into where they came from and state any caveats. Really consider the caveats and limitations in that reporting, especially whether or not they're up to date, and especially where that data came from.
Okay, looks like we might have time for if someone else doesn't have
One
anything to.
related point
Oh,
there. Sorry, and I
sure,
guess it's two related points. One would be,
sure.
and this is something that I know I'd hoped to get in and wasn't able to at the beginning. Um, we talked at the beginning just about the HSI programs and MSI programs specifically at the Department of Education, but it is worth bearing in mind that the OLC ruling probably has much broader ramifications for that, in part because so many other agencies had piggyback Me Too programs to push federal programming and federal dollars out to schools that the Department of Education had classified as minority serving institutions. I'll just make this a pitch to y'all. I have seen efforts to quantify how much money the Department of Education annually in the past pushed out through the MSI programs to minority serving institutions. The number seems to have been a little bit north of $600 million. I will flag for you, though, that there were in the middle of last year at least 4 or 5 other agencies that had their own programs. A year prior to that, I'd been able to find like 13 other agencies beyond the Department of Education. Um, as you're looking, if you're going through things like the USspending.gov, bear in mind that there might be many, many, many grants from other agencies that are being picked up in the same way. And as a flip side of this, again, because dollars are fungible and dollars are moving. I would encourage reporters not just to focus on where is money not going, but where is it being rerouted. And that's not always clear either, but sometimes it is. Like the Department of Education in its press release last fall, when it announced that it was not going to renew or issue new grants under a number of MSI programs, it simultaneously announced, or maybe it was 2 weeks later in a second press release, that it was rerouting, I think, all of those dollars to HBCUs and tribal colleges. So that also is worth considering for the more robust story of any decision has pros and cons and winners and losers for different institutions, and it's worth bearing in mind and covering who those are as well.
Thank you, Dan. Those are great points as well. And I'm going to have to. We are at 2 o'clock, so we're going to have to stop. We have so many great questions coming in. I'm so excited to have this interest in this topic. I want to thank all three of you for joining us and sharing information that I know is going to help the people in the room better understand and cover the topic. Before I say goodbye to everyone, we are going to be sending out a very brief survey. I think it's 3 questions. It's multiple choice. That's basically asking you, how did you like this webinar, and how might you use the information? It's our first survey on a webinar, and we're just trying to better understand how we can make what we offer to journalists better. So I'd love it if you would please answer those 3 questions. Thank you all for joining us. We will make the recording of this webinar available. And like I said, I will be sharing the handout that Anne Marie shared with me earlier before the webinar. So you'll have that information to help you too. Thank you so much.